Hey everyone, tonight we begin not with a battle, nor a coronation, nor even a whispered conspiracy in the halls of power. We begin with something far more intimate, something pungent. Imagine a time when people feared bathing more than the plague, while when garlic wasn't just a kitchen staple, it was perfume. And when your neighbor might lean out the window, shout Gardes low, and dump yesterday's chamber pot onto the street below. Welcome to the world of medieval hygiene, a realm of lice combs, linen undergarments, and the slow, tragic demise of the public bathhouse. But this is only the first of 5 forgotten chapters we're exploring tonight. From the steamy bathhouses of 14th century Europe, we'll journey to the astonishing grid-planned cities of the ancient Indus Valley, where 4,000 years ago, homes had indoor plumbing and sewage systems that would shame modern capitals. Then, we'll walk beside Emperor Hadrian, philosopher, builder, lover, a man who reshaped Rome not through conquest, but through marble, memory, and grief. And finally, we'll follow the Lewis and Clark expedition, a grueling 2-year odyssey across uncharted wilderness, driven by curiosity, survival, and the fragile bonds of diplomacy with the indigenous peoples who already called this land home. Each story is a window into how people lived, how they endured, and how they tried in their own flawed, brilliant ways to build order from chaos. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you? It's always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world, from midnight readers in Tokyo to early risers in Toronto. Now dim the lights. Maybe light a candle. Let the outside world fade, because tonight, we're not just learning history, we're stepping into it. Let's begin. Descent of survival. Hygiene in the medieval world. Imagine the year is 1349. The air is thick, not just with summer heat, but with the weight of fear. The Black Death has swept through Europe like a scythe. And in the silence between church bells, people whisper prayers and wipe sweat from their brows with cloth. But they do not bathe, not because they don't care, not because they're lazy, but because they believe, truly believe, that water is a killer. In the dim light of a candle, a noble woman sits by the fire, her linen undergarment freshly changed. She doesn't step into a tub. She doesn't even dip a toe in warm water. Instead, a servant gently wipes her arms with a cloth soaked in rose water and vinegar. A ritual. It's not of luxury, but of survival. Clean enough, they call it. Clean enough to be holy. Clean enough to live. This was the paradox of medieval hygiene. A world obsessed with cleanliness, yet terrified of water. Centuries earlier, the Romans had built magnificent bathhouses, steamy, social, sacred spaces where citizens soaked, scrubbed, and socialized. Their legacy lingered into the early Middle Ages. Monasteries maintained bathing rooms. Towns had public stews, so named for the steam that curled from their rooftops. For a time, cleanliness was not just possible, it was fashionable. But then came fear. By the 14th century, doctors taught that the body was a fortress, and water was the enemy at the gate. Hot water, they claimed, opened the pores, tiny doorways through which disease could seep. During the plague, to bathe was to invite death. To soak was to surrender. And the church, ever watchful, saw another danger: sin. Bathhouses, once places of health, had become places of temptation. Steam, nudity, and whispered conversations in dimly lit chambers. It was hard for bishops to declare them dens of vice. Soon, the bathhouses were shut down, boarded up, or turned into bakeries. The age of immersion was over. So how did people stay clean? They turned to linen, the unsung hero of medieval hygiene, worn close to the skin, beneath layers of wool and fur. These undergarments absorbed sweat, grime, and everything the body expelled. And unlike the body, linen could be washed. Boiled in lye, beaten on rocks, rinsed in rivers, it was scrubbed clean while the person inside remained dry. To change your linen shirt was to be clean. Not spotless, not sterile, but respectable. In a world where bathing could be deadly, clean clothes became a moral statement. For the rest, the face, the hands, the armpits, came the sponge bath, medieval style. No sponges, really. Just a scrap of cloth dampened with vinegar wine, or herbal infusions. rosemary, sage, lavender, and gently rubbed over the skin. It was less about removing dirt, more about masking the inevitable. Because yes, people did smell, and they knew it. So they fought back with pomanders. Little metal balls filled with cloves, cinnamon, or musk, worn around the neck like a charm. A lady might tuck a sachet of dried herbs into her bodice, or braid rosemary into her hair. Not just for scent, but for protection. They believed bad smells carried disease. So if you smelled good, perhaps you'd stay alive. And then there were the lice, tiny, relentless, and utterly democratic. The lice didn't care if you were king or peasant, monk or merchant. They lived in hair, in beards, in the seams of clothing. Everyone had them, everyone itched, and everyone combed. Fine-toothed combs carved from bone or wood were as common as spoons. People sat by windows, scratching and raking, searching for the tiny invaders. Some shaved their heads. Monks did it for piety, others for practicality. A bald head was a lice-free zone. Dental care, that was a battlefield. No toothbrushes, no paste. Instead, people rubbed their teeth with rags dipped in salt, crushed mint, or even charcoal. Some chewed on chewing sticks, twigs frayed at the end, used like a primitive brush. Others rinsed with vinegar or wine, hoping to drown the rot before it drowned them. Bad breath was common. Toothaches were torture, and when a tooth finally gave out, the barber pulled it. No anesthetic, just a yank and a prayer. And where did it all end? In the chamber pot. Tucked under beds, used in the dark, emptied out the window with a shout of Gardes low, watch out for the water. Waste was tossed into the street, where it joined the mud, the manure, and the rain. Open sewers ran through towns, pigs scavenged in the smell. Oh, the smell hung in the air like a curse. Laundry, when it happened, was a communal ordeal. Clothes soaked in urine for its ammonia, scrubbed on river stones, beaten with paddles. It was back-breaking, freezing, and necessary. And still, most people went weeks, even months, without a full wash. So were they dirty? Not by choice? They weren't ignorant. They weren't indifferent. We're living in a world without germ theory, without plumbing, without science, but with ritual, with ingenuity, with fear. They wiped instead of washed. They changed linen instead of bathing. They masked stench with spice. They combed lice like farmers harvest crops. And in their own way, they stayed clean enough, not for vanity, but for dignity. Because in the Middle Ages, hygiene wasn't about purity. It was about survival. Sometimes just changing your shirt was an act of courage. The blueprint of civilization. Ancient urban planning and sanitation. Close your eyes. Imagine a city, not of steel and glass, but of sun-baked brick and winding canals. A city where the streets run in perfect lines, where every home has running water and beneath your feet. Covered drains carry waste away like whispers down a secret passage. Now open your eyes. This isn't some futuristic utopia. This is Mohenjo-daro, a city built not in the 21st century, but over 4,000 years ago. Welcome to the forgotten genius of ancient urban planning, where civilization didn't just grow wild like weeds in a courtyard, but was designed with purpose, precision, with a quiet, revolutionary understanding of order. This wasn't just a settlement, it was a statement. Mohenjo-daro, the city that planned itself. If you were to walk the streets of Mohenjo-daro around 2500 BCE, you wouldn't be stumbling through a maze of huts and alleys. You'd be stepping into a grid. Straight roads, right angles, blocks laid out like tiles on a board game. North to south, east to west. No guesswork, no chaos, and beneath your feet. A sewer system so advanced it would shame many modern towns. Nearly every house, rich or poor, had its own private well, its own bathing platform, and a drain that carried wastewater into covered brick sewers running beneath the streets. These weren't open ditches, they were engineered, with access hatches for cleaning, gentle slopes to keep water moving, and even filters to catch debris. This was municipal plumbing in the Bronze Age. And it wasn't just about convenience, it was about dignity. In a world where most people would later throw their waste out the window, the people of the Indus Valley were already thinking like city planners, not just survivors. They zoned their city too. A raised citadel held public baths, granaries, and likely administrative buildings, the heart of civic life. Below it, the lower city pulsed with homes, workshops, and markets. Even the bricks were standardized, same size, same ratio, across the entire city. You could almost hear the ancient foreman saying, "No, Jorok, we don't just stack whatever we find. We have specifications." And then, one day, silence. No signs of war, no fire, no massacre, just abandonment. Climate change, drying rivers, trade collapse. We don't know. But we do know this. Mohenjo-daro wasn't a fluke. It was part of a pattern. A civilization that didn't just build cities, it designed them. It's Babylon, where power met pageantry. Now, step forward in time and space to Babylon, a city that didn't whisper. It roared. In the 6th century BCE under King Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon wasn't just a capital. It was a spectacle. Walls so wide, ancient historians claimed the chariots could race across their tops. Gates of lapis lazuli blue, studded with golden lions. The Ishtar Gate, a gateway not just to a city, but to the divine, and at its center, sacred axis, the processional way, a grand road paved for gods. Every year during the New Year festival, the statue of Marduk, Babylon's chief god, is to be paraded down this street, from the great Edamananke ziggurat, possibly the real Tower of Babel, to his temple. This wasn't just urban planning, it was theater. Architecture as propaganda. Every street, every gate, every temple screamed, "Look upon my works, you mighty," in despair. But Babylon wasn't just about show. It had water systems, clay pipes, bathrooms in wealthy homes. And yes, even a primitive flush system where water from a bucket could wash waste through a drain. Not bad for a city that also believed eclipses were omens and dragons were real. Teotihuacan, the city of the gods. Now cross the ocean. To Teotihuacan, a metropolis in ancient Mexico, rising long before the Aztecs ever laid eyes on it. By 500 CE, this city was home to over 100,000 people, one of the largest in the world. And it was perfectly laid out. Central spine, the Avenue of the Dead, stretching 2 miles, lined with pyramids, plazas, and temples. The Pyramid of the Sun, the Pyramid of the Moon, not random monuments. They were cosmic markers, aligned with celestial events, possibly the Pleiades, or the rising of the sun on sacred days. The entire city was built at a 15.5-degree tilt from true north, not by accident, but by design. Engineers, astronomers, and priests had worked together to create a city that mirrored the heavens and the people. They lived in apartment compounds, multifamily homes with shared courtyards, drainage systems, even decorative murals. Some were modest, others clearly elite, but all were connected. And the water, canals, and drains ran alongside streets, managing floods, guiding flow, proving that even in the rainforest, order could be carved from chaos. When the Aztecs later found these ruins, they didn't just admire them, they worshipped them. They called it Teotihuacan, the place where gods were born. And honestly, after seeing the symmetry, the scale, the vision, who could blame them? Harappa and Lothal, the quiet revolution. Back in the Indus Valley, Mohenjo-daro wasn't alone. Harappa, another city, another grid, another network of drains, standardized bricks, and public granaries. No palaces, no statues of kings, just efficiency. And then there's Lotho, a port city on the Arabian Sea. But not just any port. It had a dockyard, possibly the world's first, with a massive basin, sluice gates to control tides, and berths for ships. This wasn't a riverside landing. It was a shipping hub. Engineers here understood tides, currents, and trade. They weren't just surviving, they were connecting. And again, no evidence of kings, no temples towering over the poor, instead uniform housing, shared wells, common drainage. Was this an early form of equality, or just a society that valued function over fame? We don't know. But we do know this. These cities weren't ruled by ego, they were built by consensus. By a culture that believed clean water, safe streets, and fair access were not privileges, but rights. Zoning, the ancient art of order. Long before modern cities argued over parking permits and Airbnb noise complaints, the ancients were already zoning. In Mohenjo-daro, workshops were pushed to the edges. No one wanted pottery smoke in their bedroom. In Babylon, temples and palaces dominated the center. Markets and homes radiated outward. In Teotihuacan, neighborhoods were organized by craft potters here. Weavers there, and even immigrant communities lived in districts built in their homeland style. This wasn't random. It was social engineering, a way to manage people, trade, and power, all through architecture. Sanitation, the unsung hero. We love to think of the ancient world as filthy, a place of chamber pots and pestilence. But some cities were obsessed with cleanliness. Mohenjo-daro. Every house connected to a sewer. Waste carried away, not dumped in the street. Babylon. Indoor bathrooms with clay pipes. Wealthy homes had flushing systems. Teotihuacan. Storm drains. Latrines and temples. Water management built into the city's bones. These weren't luxuries. They were civilizational achievements. Because when you can flush, you're not just clean, you're advanced. Markets. The pulse of the city. And where there was order, there was also life. Markets. In Babylon, trade was regulated. By law. The Code of Hammurabi set prices, weights, and penalties for cheating. In Teotihuacan, plazas buzzed with traders selling obsidian, cacao feathers, and salt, a decentralized economy centuries before capitalism. In Mohenjo-daro, warehouses and scales suggest a trading network that stretched to Mesopotamia. Goods, money, debt, all recorded, all controlled. These weren't bazaars, they were economic engines. Temples, the soul of the city. But cities weren't just about sewage and shopping, they were about the divine. In Babylon, the ziggurat pierced the sky, a bridge between earth and heaven. In Teotihuacan, the pyramids weren't tombs, they were cosmic anchors, aligning the city with the stars. In Mohenjo-daro, the Great Bath wasn't for swimming, it was for ritual, for purification, for rebirth. Temples weren't hidden, they were center stage. Because in the ancient world, to build a city was to make an offering. The gods always got the best view, the legacy. Cities is philosophy. So what do these cities tell us? That ancient people weren't primitive, they were visionaries. They understood that a city isn't just a pile of bricks, it's a statement. It's about order, about power, about belief. So they used grids, not just for roads, but for control. Drains, not just for waste, but for dignity. Temples, not just for worship, but for identity. And when you walk through a modern city today, down a straight street, past a subway grate, beside a park that feels just right, remember, you're not just walking through space. You're walking through 4,000 years of ideas, quiet, enduring, still whispering beneath your feet. Because the first city planners didn't just build homes. They built civilization. The philosopher-emperor, the life and reign of Hadrian. Let's step out of the damp, earthy breath of the Middle Ages and into the sun-baked marble of the Roman Empire. We are in the year 117 CE. The air is thick with change. Emperor Trajan, conqueror, soldier, the last of Rome's expansionist titans, lies dead in a distant province. His body wrapped in secrecy, his final breaths lost to history. And in the silence that follows, a new emperor rises. Not from the heart of Rome, not from the bloodline of Caesar, but from the edge of the world. His name, Hadrian. And his story is not one of conquest, but of contemplation. Of a man who looked not outward to war, but inward to architecture, philosophy, and the quiet, enduring power of limits. A boy from the edge. Hadrian was born not in the Forum, but in Italica, a Roman colony in the province of Hispania, modern-day Spain. Geographically distant, culturally Roman, his family was wealthy, connected, and crucially related by blood to Emperor Trajan. But Hadrian's early life was marked by loss. By the age of 10, both his parents were gone. He was raised not by kin, but by guardians. One of them, Trajan himself. And so began a life shaped by paradox. A provincial boy thrust into the heart of imperial power. He was not the typical Roman noble. He didn't dream of battle cries and triumphal arches. He preferred Homer to horseback, scrolls to swords. Spoke Greek like a poet, debated philosophy like a Stoic, and wore his intellect like armor. But Rome didn't run on poetry. So Hadrian learned to be a soldier. He served in the legions in Mysia Pannonia, proving himself competent, disciplined, but never a warlord. His genius was not in the clash of steel, but in the quiet work of administration, of order, of vision. And when Trajan died in 117 CE, far from Rome, in the dusty hills of Asia Minor, the question of succession hung like smoke. Trajan had named no heir, and yet, within days, a letter arrived. A deathbed adoption. Hadrian, named son of the emperor. Some called it divine will. Others whispered forgery. Was it Trajan's wife Plotina who orchestrated it? Or the loyal advisor at Antinous? We may never know. But the Senate ratified it, and on August 11th, 117 CE, Hadrian became emperor. Not by conquest, but by calculation. The emperor who walked the empire. Most emperors ruled from Rome. They received reports. They issued decrees. They stayed. Hadrian did the unthinkable. He left, and he didn't come back. For over 20 years, Hadrian was on the move. A ruler who refused to govern from a throne, but instead from the saddle, the boat, the dusty road. He walked more miles than any emperor before or after. Gaul, Britain, Greece, Egypt, Asia Minor. Not as a tourist, as a sovereign inspector. He didn't just see the empire, he felt it. He stood on the northern edge of Britain, where the wind howled across the moors and the Caledonian tribes. Future Scots refused to be tamed. Rome had pushed too far. Hadrian pulled back, and in its place, he built something that would echo through time, Hadrian's Wall. 73 miles of stone. It's not to conquer, but to define. This is Rome, and beyond. It was not a symbol of strength through expansion, but of wisdom through limit. In Africa, he inspected forts. In Asia Minor, he funded temples. In Egypt, he was treated like a god, until he nearly drowned in the Nile. Everywhere he went, he left not just his presence, but his patronage. He wasn't just emperor, he was architect, the builder-emperor. Hadrian didn't just rule, he reimagined. In Rome, he rebuilt the Pantheon, not as a temple to the gods, but as a temple to the idea of Rome. A vast dome of concrete, crowned with an oculus, a hole open to the sky. It was engineering, poetry, philosophy, a building that said, "We are not just powerful, we're eternal." Outside Rome, he built his villa at Tivoli. Not a palace, but a dream. A sprawling complex of gardens, libraries, and architectural echoes from across the empire. An Egyptian canal, a Greek stoa, miniature replica of the Academy. It was Rome in miniature. The world compressed into marble and water. Hadrian wasn't building for glory. He was building a civilization. It's one where Greek philosophy and Roman law, Egyptian mysticism and Latin poetry could coexist. He didn't erase local cultures. He absorbed them. Architecture for Hadrian was diplomacy in stone. Antinous, the beloved who shaped a cult. Among the thousands who walked beside him, one name stands out. Antinous, a young man from Bithynia, beautiful, quiet, devoted. Their relationship, romantic, spiritual, deeply personal, was no secret. In 130 CE, while sailing the Nile, Antinous drowned. The circumstances unclear. Accident, suicide, ritual sacrifice. We don't know, but we know this. Hadrian was shattered, didn't hide his grief. He broadcast it. He deified Antinous, founded a city. Antinopolis on the banks of the Nile, commissioned hundreds of statues, serene, youthful, divine. Turned his lover into a god. Temples, coins, festivals, oracles. Wow. No imperial favorite had ever been honored like this. And in doing so, Hadrian did more than mourn. He challenged Rome, he said. Love can be sacred. Beauty can be divine. Grief can be eternal. And for a moment, the empire bowed. Not to power, but to love. The shadow of the Bar Kokhba revolt, but emperors cannot live only in beauty. In Judea, the other side of Hadrian's reign erupted. He sought to refound Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina, a Roman colony. He planned a temple to Jupiter on the ruins of the Jewish Second Temple. To the Jewish people, it was sacrilege. In 132 CE, Simon Bar Kokhba rose in rebellion. Charismatic, fierce, hailed by some as the Messiah, for 2 years he held Rome at bay, established a Jewish state, minted coins. But Hadrian responded with ruthless force. He summoned his best generals, deployed scorched earth tactics, crushed villages, massacred rebels. By 135 CE, it was over. Bar Kokhba dead, Jerusalem destroyed. The province renamed Syria Palestina to erase Jewish ties. Over 500,000 Jews dead, countless enslaved. It was one of the darkest chapters in Roman history, and it revealed Hadrian's other face. Not the philosopher, not the lover, but the autocrat. The man who, when challenged, ruled with iron. The final years, a soul in decline. By 133 CE, the emperor who had walked the world could barely walk at all. Illness, likely heart or kidney failure, took hold. He grew weak, depressed, obsessed with death. He wrote poetry. One line echoes through time. Glula blad, klola, little soul, wandering, gentle, ... A whisper to his own spirit, fragile, fleeting. He had no son. So he adopted Antinous Pius with one condition, that he, in turn, adopt Marcus Aurelius. In that moment, Hadrian engineered the next 2 generations of Rome, the 5 good emperors, golden age of peace, law, and philosophy. But Hadrian would not live to see it. Died in 138 CE at age 62. His body cremated. His ashes placed in the mausoleum of Hadrian, the towering cylinder on the Tiber, later known as Castel Sant'Angelo, a fortress of memory, legacy. The emperor who redefined power. Hadrian did not conquer. He conserved. He did not expand. He defined. His reign was not about new lands, but about what Rome meant. He was a builder, not a destroyer, thinker, not just a ruler. He walked the empire not to dominate, but to understand. And in doing so, he transformed what it meant to be emperor. He's not a warlord, but a curator of civilization. When he died, he left behind no new provinces, but he left behind a wall that still stands, a temple that still inspires, a villa that still dreams, a love that still echoes. Hadrian was not perfect. He was human, a man of contradictions, a beauty and brutality, a philosophy and power. But in the end, he gave Rome something rare: measure. And in a world that still chases endless growth, endless conquest, endless noise, perhaps we need Hadrian now more than ever. Sometimes the greatest act of strength is knowing when to stop. Into the unknown, the Lewis and Clark expedition, it began, not with a trumpet blast, but with the quiet creak of a keelboat settling into the current. May 14th, 1804. The banks of the Missouri River, just north of St. Louis, a small flotilla pushes off into the unknown. 1 large keelboat, 2 smaller pirogues, and 33 men. Soldiers, frontiersmen, boatmen, and a few quiet dreamers, hauling 10 tons of supplies, scientific instruments, and a nation's hopes. This was the cause of discovery, and they were about to vanish into a continent. Jefferson's vision, a continent to know? The journey began not on the river, but in the mind of Thomas Jefferson. Just 2 years earlier, in 1803, he had pulled off one of history's greatest real estate deals, the Louisiana Purchase. For $15 million, the United States had doubled in size, adding over 800,000 square miles of uncharted wilderness. But Jefferson didn't just want land. He wanted knowledge. He wanted to know. What rivers flowed where? What mountains stood in the way? What plants, animals, and people lived in this vast, unmapped expanse? And most of all, was there a Northwest Passage, a continuous water route to the Pacific, a dream that had haunted explorers for centuries? To answer these questions, he chose Meriwether Lewis, his personal secretary, a man of science, quiet intensity, and frontier grit. Lewis, in turn, picked William Clark, a seasoned soldier, skilled mapmaker, and natural leader. They were equals in purpose, though only Lewis held a formal commission. Their partnership would become the expedition's bedrock, a rare balance of intellect and instinct, diplomacy, and discipline.
Oh.
They would not conquer. They would discover. And so, with Jefferson's detailed instructions, observe, document, trade, and claim, they set off. Not to fight, but to understand. Up the Missouri, into the wild. The Missouri River was their highway, and their tormentor. Deceptively powerful, choked with sandbars, snags, and swirling currents, it fought them every mile.
Oh.
The men pulled with ropes, and rode with raw muscle, often making just 10 to 15 miles a day. Progress was measured not in distance, but in endurance. They passed through a world untouched by American boots. Endless prairies, towering bluffs, herds of bison so vast they darkened the horizon. Grizzly bears, prairie dogs, and strange new birds that Lewis carefully sketched and described in his journal. But more than nature, they encountered people. The Missouri was not empty. It was home to dozens of indigenous nations. The Oto, Missouria, Teton, Sioux, and many others, each with their own languages, customs, and power. The corps carried peace medals, flags, and gifts, beads, mirrors, knives, symbols of a new nation reaching westward. But the message was layered. We come in friendship, but we are here. Some tribes welcomed them. Others were wary. The Teton Sioux nearly came to blows, demanding tribute to let the expedition pass. Tense standoffs were diffused by calm words, firm postures, and the sheer presence of a well-armed party. Diplomacy was not optional. It was survival. Winter at Fort Mandan, the turning point. By autumn 1804, the river was freezing. They had traveled over 1,600 miles, but the Rockies still loomed far ahead. They built Fort Mandan near present-day Washburn, North Dakota, a wooden stockade rising from the frozen prairie. Fragile bubble of warmth in a world of howling wind and sub-zero cold. Inside, life continued. Lewis and Clark recorded everything. Weather, plants, tribal customs, even the number of corn kernels in a Mandan cob. Their journals were not just logs. They were scientific archives of a continent. And here they met two people who would change everything. Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian fur trapper, was hired as an interpreter. But it was his young Shoshone wife, Sacagawea, who would become the expedition's quiet hero. She was pregnant, just 16 years old, and kidnapped from her people years before. She carried not just a child, but knowledge of languages, of plants, of the western lands they had yet to see. When she gave birth to Jean-Baptiste in the middle of winter, the men saw it as a good omen, a sign that life could endure even here. And in the spring, when the snow melted, she would prove indispensable. Through the Rockies, hunger, cold, and hope, April 1805, the corps pushed west again, lighter, faster, more urgent. They passed the great falls of the Missouri, not one waterfall, but 5, spanning 18 miles of thundering rapids. The men spent a month portaging, hauling boats and supplies over land on crude carts, muscles screaming, spirits tested. Then the Rockies. They had imagined mountains like the gentle Appalachians. Instead, they found the bitter roots, jagged, snow-choked, and endless. With the Missouri behind them, they needed horses. And they needed the Shoshone. When they finally made contact, fortune smiled. The Shoshone chief was Sacagawea's brother. Reunited after years of separation, she stood between two worlds. Interpreter, diplomat, bridge. The Shoshone provided horses, food, and guides. Without them, the corps would have starved. But the crossing was still a nightmare. Narrow trails. Ate starvation. They ate candles, boiled rawhide. Chewed on horse meat, Clark wrote. We are entirely out of provisions and subsisting on horse meat. It was the lowest point of the journey. And yet, they did not break. The Pacific, a gray, rain-soaked dream. When they finally emerged from the mountains, the Nez Perce tribe saved them, feeding the starving men, nursing them back to health, and helping them build canoes. Down the clear water, then the Snake, then the mighty Columbia River, wild, fast, and treacherous. They passed through lands of the Chinook and Sahaptin peoples, sophisticated traders, fishermen, and canoe builders. They marveled at the abundance of salmon, the towering plank houses, the intricate cultures that had thrived here for millennia. And then on November 15th, 1805, through the mist and rain, they saw it, the Pacific Ocean. Not a triumphant beach, not a golden shore, just a gray, stormy expanse churning under a leaden sky. Clark wrote in his journal, "Ocean in view, oh the joy." But the joy was short-lived. They built Fort Clatsop, a damp, cramped shelter on the muddy banks of the Columbia. The winter of 1805 to 1806 was brutal. It rained 330 days out of the year. Fleas infested their clothes. Scurvy loomed. Elk meat was tough, and firewood was wet. Yet still they worked. Lewis described sea otters. Clark refined his maps. They traded with the Clatsop and Chinook, not always easily. These people were not eager hosts. They expected fair trade, not charity, and the men grew restless. Bored, sick, they had reached the ocean. Now they had to go back, the return, scattered, scarred, and whole. In March 1806, they turned east, but not as one. Lewis and Clark made a bold decision, split the party. Lewis would take a small group north, up the Marias River, to map its extent and assert American claims. Clark would take the main group down the Yellowstone, charting a new route. It was risky. No radios, no way to communicate. If one group failed, the other might never know. Lewis's journey nearly ended in disaster. Near the Marias, his group encountered Blackfeet warriors, initially friendly, but growing suspicious of their guns and trade goods. In a tense night, a fight broke out. 2 Blackfeet men were killed, the only violent deaths caused by the expedition. Lewis and his men fled, riding hard through the night, hearts pounding, knowing they had crossed the line. Clark's group had its own trials, bison stampedes, injuries, but also wonder. They floated down the Yellowstone, marveling at its beauty, building canoes, and reuniting with Sacagawea and her family. On August 12, 1806, the groups reunited near the Missouri. The Corps was whole again, tired, scarred, but alive. They floated downstream, the current now their ally. And on September 23, 1806, they reached St. Louis. No parades, no crowds. Just stunned silence. Many had assumed they were dead. Instead, they returned, thinner, weathered, their uniforms in tatters, but carrying something priceless. Over 8,000 miles traveled. Dozens of maps, hundreds of plant and animal specimens, journals filled with observations, diplomacy, and awe. They had done it. They had crossed a continent. Legacy, triumph, and tragedy. But the story doesn't end with celebration. Meriwether Lewis was appointed governor of the Louisiana Territory, but struggled with depression, alcohol, and debt. 3 years later, in 1809, he died at an inn along the Natchez Trace, officially by suicide, though mystery still clings to his end. William Clark thrived. He became a key figure in Western expansion, serving as Indian agent and territorial governor. He named his first son Meriwether Lewis Clark, a quiet tribute to his lost brother. Sacagawea returned west with her family. Her exact fate is debated, but her legacy grew into legend, symbol of resilience, guidance, and the often overlooked role of indigenous women in history. York Clark's enslaved man had earned deep respect from native tribes for his strength and presence, but Clark refused to free him for years. A bitter irony in a journey that claimed to represent freedom, the real journey. The Lewis and Clark expedition was not just a trek across land, it was a collision of worlds. It opened the West to American expansion, but at a cost. It documented nature with scientific rigor, but often failed to understand the people who had lived in balance with it for centuries. It was a triumph of endurance, and a warning. Because to explore is human, but to understand what you've changed in the process, that's the real journey, and that journey still unfolding. The echoes of the journey. Aftermath and legacy of the Lewis and Clark expedition, they returned not with fanfare, but with silence. September 23, 1806, St. Louis. A small crowd gathers at the riverbank, squinting into the morning mist. A battered keelboat emerges from the fog, its sails torn, its hull scarred, its men gaunt, weathered, and wrapped in animal skins. No one cheers, no one knows what to say. Because for over 2 years the Corps of Discovery had been gone, not just from sight, from memory, presumed dead by many. And now, impossibly, they were back. Alive, whole, and carrying something far heavier than their journals. They carried the weight of a continent, the return, triumph, and the quiet aftermath. The newspapers would call it a triumph. President Thomas Jefferson would weep with relief, but triumph is loud, and what followed was not. Meriwether Lewis, the quiet naturalist, the man who had mapped rivers and named birds, was given a hero's title, governor of the Louisiana Territory. But the wilderness had changed him. The silence of the mountains, the grief of loss, the burden of command, they followed him into the world of politics, bureaucracy, and debt. He struggled with alcohol, with depression, with the gap between what he had seen and what the world now expected of him. And on October 11, 1809, at an isolated inn along the Natchez Trace, Meriwether Lewis died. The official story, suicide. But mystery clings to his end like river mist. Was it despair? Was it an accident? Or something darker? We may never know, but we do know this. The man who had walked across a continent could not find his way back into peace. William Clark, the keeper of memory. While Lewis unraveled, William Clark endured. He became superintendent of Indian affairs, a key figure in the westward expansion that the expedition had helped set in motion. He raised a family. He built a life. And in a quiet, powerful act of remembrance, he named his firstborn son, Meriwether Lewis Clark. Not for fame, not for politics. A promise that the man who had shared his dreams, his dangers, and his silence would not be forgotten. Clark lived a long life, respected, influential, a bridge between two worlds. But in his later years, he would sometimes pause at the river's edge, looking west, as if listening for the sound of a paddle on still water. Sacagawea, the woman who guided a nation. And what of Sacagawea? She returned west with her husband, Toussaint Charbonneau, and their son, Jean-Baptiste. Her exact fate is debated. Some say she died in 1812 at Fort Manuel in present-day South Dakota. Others believe she lived for decades among the Shoshone, returning to the people from whom she had been taken as a child. But her legacy was never in doubt. She was more than a guide. She was a translator. Yes, a navigator, certainly. But more than that, she was a sign of peace. When tribes saw a woman traveling with armed men, carrying a child, they knew this was not a war party. Her presence disarmed suspicion. Her knowledge saved lives. She was the quiet thread that held diplomacy together. And yet for decades her name was buried in footnotes. Not forgotten exactly, but understated. Only later would she rise, in statues and history books, in the hearts of those who understood. No expedition could have succeeded without her. York, the man who was not free. And then there was York, Clark's enslaved man, a man of immense strength, whose presence fascinated the native tribes they encountered. Some believed he was a spirit, his dark skin unlike any they had seen. Others treated him with deep respect, as an equal. But when the journey ended, he was still property. He asked for his freedom. Clark refused. For years, York was forced to serve, even after all they had endured together. The irony is unbearable. A man who crossed mountains, survived starvation, and stood shoulder to shoulder with the Corps, honored by strangers, but denied freedom by the man he called master. History does not record his final years, but it cannot erase the contradiction that in a journey about discovery, liberty, and new beginnings, one of its most vital members was never allowed to be free. The land, a continent transformed. The expedition had mapped a path, but it had also opened a door. And through that door poured trappers, traders, settlers, and soldiers. The West was no longer unknown. It was wanted. The maps Lewis and Clark drew would guide the Oregon Trail, the railroads, the gold rush, while their journals became blueprints for expansion. But for the indigenous peoples, the Mandan, the Nez Perce, the Shoshone, the Chinook, this was not progress. It was the beginning of the end. Their lands were now charted, their rivers claimed, their sovereignty ignored. The peace medals they had accepted, symbols of alliance, became relics of a broken promise. Because the Corps of Discovery did not just find a land, it unlocked it. And what came after was not always kind. Legacy, the duality of discovery. So what do we remember? Do we remember the courage, The 2 years of relentless endurance, the crossing of mountains, the first American eyes on the Pacific. Yes, do we remember the science, the hundreds of new species documented, the precise maps, the journals filled with wonder? Yes, but must we also remember the cost? The displacement, the broken treaties, the lives lost, not just in the journey, but because of it. Yes, because history is not just a story of heroes. It is a story of consequences. And the Lewis and Clark expedition stands at the crossroads. It was a masterpiece of exploration and a harbinger of change. It showed what humans can endure and what empires can destroy. Closing. The journey never ends. So we return at last to that quiet moment on the riverbank. The boat emerges from the mist. The men step ashore. And for a moment, just a moment, the world holds its breath because something has changed. Not just in the map, but in us. We have crossed a threshold, from ignorance to knowledge, from myth to reality, from dream to deed. But the real journey, it never ends. It lives in every question we ask, every border we cross, every person we meet who sees the world differently. It lives in the journals that still speak, in the rivers that still flow, in the names Lewis Clark, Sacagawea, York, that remind us who walked before. That lives in you, wherever you are, whatever time it is. As you listen to these words, thousands of miles from the Missouri, from the Rockies, from the Pacific shore, you are part of this story, because history is not just what happened, it's what we remember and what we do with that memory. So thank you for watching, for listening, for being here. And if you enjoyed this journey, if it made you think or feel or wonder, then yes, please like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments. Where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you? Because every voice, every location, every moment adds to the story. And now, as we close, take a breath, look out the window, and remember. Somewhere a river is flowing, a mountain stands in silence, and a path, old, forgotten, or just beginning, waits to be walked. Until next time, sleep well, and dream of distant shores.